and I'm also president of Geostrategic Analysis and a visiting fellow at the Atlantic Council as well. I'm joined today by Dave Charrington of ANWA, who is my co-host, along with Jeff Crater, for the series we do on the National Nuclear Security Administration. And occasionally I've asked David to come in and join me along with Jeff on some of these events that I do here. I think we have well over 100 people that are joined us today. We have two extraordinary speakers. We have Chris Ford and John Harvey. I wanted John to talk about the nuts and bolts of nuclear deterrence, particularly the platforms and the NNSA and the things that make up the deterrent, and give us a kind of a end of year review of what happened and where are we, where we're going. And then Chris Ford to look at the international implications, strategic implications of what we've seen in the world with a huge Chinese buildup and the Russians on a serial basis threatening to use nuclear weapons, and now supposedly training Belarus pilots to fly airplanes that are capable of dropping nuclear weapons, and other developments. And with that, David, I'll turn it over to you for a few comments, and then we're going to go to John Harvey first, and then Chris Ford. Both will speak about 20 minutes, and then we'll go to Q&A. Over to you, David.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's really good to see everyone. And what do we like, the last stop between us and the holidays? But really appreciate this and all year the teamwork and the teaming with Peter Husey and the Hudson Institute, along from us from ANWA Deterrence Center. Unfortunately, my colleague Jeff Crater can't be here today, but sends his best wishes. And we just really appreciate having the opportunity to bring forward such excellent speakers as we have today. And so, Peter, thanks for that, and I look forward to hearing from our speakers today.
So, John Harvey, over to you, sir.
Peter, David, Hudson, ANWA, thanks for inviting me today. I'm really happy to participate, particularly with Chris Ford. I read everything he writes and continue to be impressed. I will address 4 strategic issues that have achieved increased prominence over the last year: status of U.S. modernization program, the release of the Biden nuclear posture review, the problem of deterring the 2 nuclear peer threat, and the problem of deterring limited nuclear first use in conflict. First, modernization. Over the next 2 decades, the U.S. will complete a complex modernization program that will involve the near simultaneous replacement of every leg of the aging triad, a major upgrade to the nuclear command and control system, and recapitalization of NNSA's aging warhead production infrastructure. Over the past decade, this program has received strong bipartisan support from several administrations and Congresses. The DoD modernization program currently underway seeks to field a new Columbia-class ballistic missile submarine to replace the Ohio-class submarines deployed since the 1980s, develop a follow-on Sentinel ICBM to replace the aging Minuteman III, field the new B-21 Raider strategic bomber, field a long-range standoff missile to go with that bomber to replace the current air-launched cruise missile, meet deterrence requirements to allies with a nuclear-capable F-35 Joint Strike Fighter deployed with a life-extended B-61 bomb, and just this week we've heard the Germans are going to buy the F-35. Field the next-generation nuclear command and control system that is responsible to both advancing threats, very importantly cyber threats, and the evolving vision for modern conflict. And finally, develop and field in the next decade, if authorized and funded, a nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missile. For NNSA, the no less important series of programs is being executed to complete on time 5 warhead life extension programs: the B-61-12 bomb, the W-76-1, which is now completed, the W-88 Alt SLBM warhead, the W-87-1 ICBM warhead, and the W-84 for LRSO, W-80-4 for LRSO. The execution is to field a low-yield warhead for the Trident D5 SLBM, which has also been accomplished in the last year before last. The DOE must plan to retain the B-83 bomb in the nuclear stockpile. It must continue work on a modern Navy SLBM warhead. This is not a life extension program. This is a modern warhead called the Mark 7 W93. DOE and NNSA must advance concept and feasibility studies for a modern nuclear sea launch cruise missile warhead, again, if authorized and funded. It must carry forward 9 large capital construction projects, among them to provide enduring capability and capacity to produce plutonium pits at a rate of no fewer than 80 pits per year by 2030, restore safe, environmentally sound manufacture of highly enriched uranium components at the Y-12 plant in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, ensure the necessary reactor and enrichment capacity and availability of sufficient, unobligated, low-enriched uranium to produce tritium for nuclear warheads, and ensure continuity in U.S. capability to develop and manufacture secure, trusted, rad-hard microelectronic systems beyond 2025 to support stockpile modernization. NNSA faces a related challenge. It must continue the process of transforming NNSA itself and its culture to become an efficient, cost-effective, organizationally coherent entity for working cooperatively with the Department of Defense in overseeing and modernizing the U.S. nuclear stockpile. And I must add that over the last 5 years with Lisa Gordon Haggerty and with Jill Ruby, the progress is being made in that area. The depth and breadth of this overall program and enormous execution challenges takes one's breath away. Even so, there is little flexibility to observe further delay without affecting robust nuclear deterrence. As former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter said, may he rest in peace, either replace aging platforms and systems or we must remove them from service. There is no other choice. Some recent developments in the modernization program. The FY23 Compromise National Defense Authorization Act authorizes DoD and NNSA funds to keep the SLCM-N program going for another year. $25 million for DoD, $20 million to NNSA for the warhead. The NDAA also establishes a portfolio management framework to enable DoD and NNSA to jointly manage through the Nuclear Weapons Council program execution risks that cross-cut the entire set of nuclear forces modernization activities underway. This is a critically important effort. The rollout of the B-21 earlier this month at Edwards Air Force Base was a highlight for the year. It's an amazing looking aircraft scheduled for its first flight in the next year. The Sentinel ICBM is also expected to fly next year. According to news reports, highly innovative digital twin technology being exploited in the program is expected to deliver the initial unit sooner and at lower cost. And just so you don't forget, I put an exclamation point after lower cost, because that's not usually, lower cost is not usually the norm for acquisition programs, either in DoD or NNSA, and we'll see. I'm hoping. Turning to the NPR, President Biden has conducted a wide-ranging review of U.S. nuclear weapons policies, programs, and posture. That review, the 2022 Nuclear Posture Review, was completed earlier this year. After substantial delay, an unclassified version of the report was issued on October 27th. Making the 2022 NPR somewhat more complex is that it was carried out in the midst of a crisis in Europe caused by Russia's invasion in February of Ukraine, Putin's increased nuclear threats to the West, and China's sprint from a minimum deterrent force to nuclear peer status and Beijing's increasingly strident threats to take Taiwan by force. All of this has evolved significantly over the past year, right as the NPR was being carried out. At issue is whether the NPR goes far enough in addressing these evolving threats. That said, the NPR should be lauded for the many elements of continuity with past US policies. I'm going to list them here. It affirms the necessity of a strategic triad of land and sea-based ballistic missiles and bombers, along with European basing of US nuclear bombs carried by NATO aircraft. These capabilities provide the basis for deterring war and assuring allies of continued US commitments to their security. It recognizes that Russia's and China's coercive strategies of limited nuclear threats to advance expansionist goals and the need for tailored, flexible US deterrence capabilities to defeat those strategies. It affirms that deterrence is not based solely on the existence of nuclear weapons or nuclear forces, but rather on their ability to hold at risk assets most valued by the enemy. Thus, force numbers and capabilities matter and can be adjusted in light of evolving threats. It recognized that the United States must also be prepared for the possibility of an opponent's first use of nuclear weapons, either limited or large scale, and to restore deterrence. It calls for the restoration of a nuclear weapons R&D and manufacturing base capable of responding promptly to unanticipated technical problems with warheads and delivery systems, or to adverse geopolitical change. Correspondingly, the Biden administration is fully funding infrastructure modernization. It affirms, taking into account allies' views, longstanding policy that deterring a nuclear attack is the fundamental but not the sole purpose of US nuclear weapons. They also deter major conventional war and catastrophic non-nuclear attack that could result in mass US or allied casualties approximating those inflicted by a nuclear strike. It reiterates negative security assurances as part of US declaratory policy. It affirms a willingness to work with Russia to reduce nuclear dangers when and if, a big if, Russia is prepared to work to that end. It reaffirms that the United States will not pursue policies that purposely target innocent civilians. Those were all the good things that came out of the NPR. In addition, the NPR largely reaffirms a modernization program begun under Obama and continued by Trump to replace nuclear forces that have aged well beyond the end of their planned service lives. Biden's FY23 budget request is fully consistent with this NPR commitment. Those aspects of the 2020 NPR should garner broad bipartisan support, but there are some shortfalls. The Biden NPR does not go far enough in addressing the worsened threat environment with concrete responses for continuing to deter Russia and China. It is important to establish the context for my critique. As I pointed out earlier, major changes in the security environment were evolving simultaneously with the 2022 NPR. As a result, I'm prepared to cut the administration some slack for not yet having solutions to the challenges it correctly identifies. Urgent follow-on work to the 2022 NPR should address such solutions. I call attention to two pressing NPR shortfalls: how best to deter both the two nuclear peer threat and the potential limited nuclear first use in conventional regional conflict threat. Somebody's got their mic on, they should mute it. On the two nuclear peer threat, in the past, US nuclear forces were focused on Russia. In a sense, China was a lesser included case. The emergence of China, and I'm sure Chris is going to go into this in much more detail, toward nuclear peer status is seen as a prospect for the mid-2030s. It changes the calculation. Quoting from the NPR, by the 2030s, the US will, for the first time in its history, face two major nuclear powers as strategic competitors and potential adversaries, They will create new stresses on stability and new challenges for deterrence, assurance, arms control, and risk reduction. Can the US continue to deter China as a nuclear peer, an aggressive Russia, or possibly both simultaneously with existing nuclear forces, or will it need to increase the force? Relatedly, is the current modernization program sufficient to address threats that will evolve significantly over the 50 to 70 years that these nuclear systems are to remain in the field? Very simply put, we design a baseline nuclear force to address the threat that we anticipate. The so-called hedge is intended to provide options to adjust that force in the event we guess wrong on the threat or something else bad happens technically. China's aggressive effort to ramp up its ICBM force is precisely the unanticipated surprise event for which a hedge was contemplated. That said, deterring a hostile Russia and China, possibly at the same time, has been a feature of US nuclear policy for decades. Let me take a quick sip. During the Cold War, even in light of a major nuclear exchange with Russia, the US maintained sufficient survivable warheads in reserve to deter any incentive by China to pile on. But this was during a time when Russia and the US had maintained several thousand strategic warheads, while China possessed just a few tens of ICBMs that could reach the US. There was flexibility in US forces to deter both. Today, with US operationally deployed strategic warheads capped at 1550 under New START, China is ramping up to potentially several thousand ICBM warheads. Limiting options is the fact that the intensive ongoing program to modernize each triad leg and the command and control system leaves little, if any, excess capacity for DoD or NNSA to respond with new program starts in the near term. For now, I see three options in advancing our thinking on how to respond to China's buildup. First, do nothing for now, forces-wise. Focus on diplomacy and arms control to manage this competition. If it takes China until 2035, as estimates suggest, to complete its buildup, then there is some time for dialogue. Option two, revisit doctrine, targeting, and employment policy to see what changes might be needed to achieve multipolar deterrence objectives with currently planned forces. Option three, plan now under existing nuclear doctrine to augment current force size or composition and possibly bolster missile defenses as China's buildup is realized. In the near term, US forces could be augmented by uploading reserve warheads to existing delivery systems. In the longer term, the ongoing modernization program enables an option that hot production lines for the Sentinel ICBM, the B-21 bomber, Columbia, LRSO, nuclear warheads, and the like could be extended once their originally intended build is completed. For a threat that may materialize in the mid-2030s, however, this option is not sufficiently responsive. If we field Columbia at a rate of 1 per year, starting, say, in 2030, then the 13th sub, the hedge sub, would not come off the production line until the early 2040s. Deploying 400 Sentinel ICBMs at an estimated rate of 1 per week, again starting in 2030, means that additional ICBMs at their earliest would not be fielded until the late 2030s. So let's examine what could be done sooner by uploading reserve warheads to existing delivery systems. Under the 1550 warhead limit, the US allocates about 1,090 warheads to the SSBN force, to the submarine force, 400 single warhead ICBMs, and according to the bomber counting rule, 60 warheads assigned to heavy bombers, 1 each, although each can carry multiple Alcoms and bombs. Moving Minuteman III and uploading SLBM warheads to currently unoccupied slots on the D5 bus could add close to 1,000 additional warheads to the deployed force. Uploading outcomes to B-52 bombers, they carry up to 20, but are typically deployed with fewer, would add significantly to that total. To be sure, uploading does add some operational inefficiencies. Still, this is not an insignificant force augmentation capability. Let me turn to limited nuclear use, first use. The NPR rightly calls attention to rising concerns that an adversary may introduce limited first use of low-yield nuclear weapons to an ongoing conventional conflict as means to achieve a more favorable outcome. We call this, or I think someone coined this as the escalate to win strategy. Allies view with alarm the deteriorating global security environment in general, and are particularly sensitive to the possibility of escalation of a conventional conflict in their region to nuclear. The National Defense Strategy, partly as a result, calls for strengthened extended deterrence to allies. Nuclear modernization in itself is necessary, but not sufficient. After all, much of the ongoing modernization program was established more than a decade ago, when the security environment was much more benign and was intended to replace, not increase or restructure existing nuclear forces. Inattention to achieving needed capabilities could cause allies to call into question U.S. resolve to come to their defense. If the only alternative is escalation to strategic attack on U.S. territory, allies may decide to accommodate regional adversaries or develop their own nuclear weapons, both contrary to longstanding U.S. interests. Accordingly, a wider range of employment options would strengthen deterrence of limited first use and further deter allies. No adversary should ever come to believe that such use would not risk a U.S. nuclear response because it perceives that the U.S. lacks timely and proportional weapons options that can penetrate to critical targets. The NPR comments positively on the important role played by the low-yield Trident II warhead in helping deter limited first use. For the same reason, the 2022 NPR decision to cancel the nuclear SLCM should be reconsidered. SLCM-N provides unique capabilities not replicated by other nuclear weapons for both deterrence and assurance. Congress should continue authorizing funds for the program as it has in the FY23 NDAA and extend funding to the out years. Let me conclude. In summary, the modernization program is largely on track. Continued bipartisan support for the program within Congress and between Congress and the President over the next decade and more will help to keep it on track. Central tenets of the 2022 NPR are clearly in the mainstream of U.S. nuclear policy and deserve full bipartisan support. At the same time, there are a few critical shortfalls. The Biden team over the coming years should address and hopefully resolve them as part of its planned upcoming revision to U.S. nuclear employment policy. Thank you.
Much, John Harvey, and now over to Chris Ford.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Peter. And David, thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure. I'll say a few words. John's done a good job of covering the programmatic side of things. And so I guess what I'd like to do is try to perhaps put the Biden NPR into sort of a broader geopolitical context, because I think it actually really interestingly illustrates just what a very new world we find ourselves in right now, and to which all of this thinking about nuclear doctrine and posture and force levels and whatever else it may be, all of this is, in many ways, this is an opportunity and both a challenge and an opportunity to think through where we go next in light of this changed context. So you will not be surprised here that I do not agree with everything in the NPR, but I think in many ways it is an intriguingly important document and says a lot of valuable things in highlighting the degree to which the world is a different place than many of us have gotten used to working these policy issues over the last generation or so. Naturally, I'm speaking only for myself. Not on behalf of the MITRE Corporation or the Hoover Institution. So just please don't blame them for anything I say. So to frame the question, I would say that since the beginning of the nuclear era, the strategic environment has had two fundamental characteristics from sort of a nuclear weapons perspective. First, it has had a fundamentally sort of bilateral or dyadic structure, if you will, in which the core challenges of deterrence and strategic stability revolved around a tense US nuclear weapons standoff with a single strategic nuclear peer or near peer adversary state. So that's the first characteristic. The second one is that this global context has been one in which the United States had at least a second to none conventional military force posture, and in which that position of US power and global reach was backed up by, frankly, a vastly predominant civilian economy with huge industrial and productive capacities, enormous technological sophistication, relative wealth compared to other states in the world, and so forth. So those are two characteristics. There are two additional characteristics that maybe not for the entire nuclear era, but for the post-Cold War piece of it, we have become very accustomed to as well. And so the third is that from the perspective of American leaders and how the broader nuclear weapons, arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament community, how folks have viewed the strategic environment. The third factor is that with the end of the Cold War rivalry, and that having thankfully made it no longer necessary to maintain huge Cold War level arsenals, the idea took root for many years that it was not just desirable, but finally now actually possible to move forward toward the elimination of nuclear weapons in the security environment. And from this, as the two former strategic adversaries, of course, began to cut their arsenals down quite dramatically, it became an assumption, not just of international diplomacy, but I would say also to a great degree of our own national strategic planning, that the nuclear weapons world was on some kind of eventually inevitable trajectory toward zero, as it were. Now, of course, there are lots of disagreements always about the pace, the timing, the tactics, and the relative prioritization of agenda items along this pathway, right? But I think, as any of you who have spent any significant time, especially in the diplomatic arena on these topics, will certainly know, the sort of teleology of disarmament acquired an almost sort of axiomatic, unquestioned salience. And a lot of this is true even within our own policy community, as I said. So that's the third factor. And the fourth factor that has been kind of an architectural fundamental that we've become very accustomed to feeling in this policy arena is that over the last generation, there was a very clear fourth assumption that became very deeply ingrained, namely that in the world of nuclear threats, the ones that were increasing, the most worrisome, troubling ones, the pacing threats, if you will, were ones that were, and by the way, overall nuclear threats were not increasing during that period, and that's an important piece. But the ones that were ones that were related to proliferation. That is to say, rogue states that were developing the most dangerous folks with the most dangerous toys, as someone once said. The problems of that post-Cold War era were ones of rogue regimes acquiring those weapons and thereby catalyzing some really deeply destabilizing regional conflicts and potential escalation scenarios. So those four elements, I think for many years became really deeply rooted in our sort of subconscious, if you will, in the nuclear policy arena. And have been, as I said, the foundation upon which so much of our thinking and our reflexes and our assumptions are built. But that's where I think the new NPR is especially important because it, although in many ways it doesn't say new things, I think John's quite right. There's an enormous amount of continuity from the previous NPR, for example. But what it does is it essentially validates from the other side of the political aisle the fact that it is very clear to everyone in the US policy community now that those four assumptions are all in question. They are, I think, collapsing. Events in the last few years have called every one of them in question. For example, it is quite clear from the new Biden NPR that the primary nuclear threats today come from the near peers of Russia and China, and especially China. The rogues we all love to hate are still, of course, hugely problematic, but they're being outshone by even darker suns in the firmament, as it were, and their dangers are not the most significant or perhaps pressing ones that we face. What's more, those threats are not simply not diminishing, they are rapidly increasing. And the main problem comes from those two strategic adversaries, not the rogues anymore. As the National Defense Strategy recently put it, also recently released, Russia is the most immediate acute threat, but China is the most important long-term one, the pacing threat, as it were, for US nuclear planning in the present era. The Russians, as the NPR notes, are both modernizing and expanding their arsenal. The Kremlin is brandishing nuclear weapons in support of its revisionist security policy. And specifically, Moscow has been using that growing nuclear arsenal, which, by the way, is much larger than ours if you count all of those sort of sub-strategic weapons. It is using that arsenal as a shield behind which to wage unjustified aggression against its neighbors. Now, that's pretty much a quote from the NPR. This is not just something that people like myself have been pointing to for some time. And these are qualitatively new things in the firmament that we need to worry about from a strategic deterrence and stability perspective. Now, as for China, the pace of that pacing threat is one that continues to accelerate. Now, I think the new NPR plays a little bit of hide the ball here in its own terms, which you can sort of see from the subsequently released DoD 2022 China military power report, which makes the picture seem even grimmer. But altogether, it's quite clear that China is building up its arsenal at a truly extraordinary pace. Indeed, according to the most recent DoD report, by 2035, China is likely to have about 1,500 deliverable strategic warheads, a figure that is actually larger than the US arsenal of such warheads right now under New START counting rules, which stands at about 1,420 or so, according to our September 2022 declaration. So Beijing is sprinting to at least parity and to perhaps something more. So as a result of all of these nuclear developments, this calls into question that sort of first architectural piece of the nuclear era that I mentioned before, the idea that strategic nuclear deterrence and stability are a dyadic problem. They are no longer a dyadic problem. As the NPR observes, and I'll quote you here, by the 2030s, the United States will, for the first time in its history, face two major nuclear powers as strategic competitors and potential adversaries. This will create new stresses on stability and new challenges for deterrence and risk reduction. That is certainly true, and if anything, it understates the challenge. So that's three of the four architectural assumptions that we've gotten used to that are essentially collapsing under the weight of events. But what's also striking about the Biden NPR is the degree that even for an administration that is stuffed full of veterans of the Obama administration, which was quite well known for its disarmament rhetoric and in fact got a Nobel Prize for encouraging everyone's hopes in that respect. The new NPR makes pretty clear that thanks to Russia and to China, that zero teleology, to which I referred earlier, has essentially run out of steam. Now, you might have expected that President Joe Biden would follow up on Vice President Biden's promise just a few years ago to ensure that the sole purpose of nuclear weapons is to deter the use of other nuclear weapons. But that isn't the case, of course, as John mentioned. The new NPR doesn't merely decline to adopt the sole purpose doctrine, however. It actually adopts the Trump administration's declaratory policy that nuclear weapons have a role in deterring what are now termed other high consequence strategic level attacks, whether or not they take nuclear form. And that's not a trivial thing. And to acknowledge that says a great deal, especially in light of where the strategic environment has been going. Moreover, despite some rhetorical flourishes about how much the administration hopes at some point to resume progress towards disarmament, one also sees in the new NPR an all but explicit retirement, both of the zero teleology, its anticipation of continued inevitable and irreversible progress, and of the idea that the United States should lead global progress toward disarmament. That was a fundamental piece of where the Obama administration came from. But fundamentally now, the NPR from the Biden administration pledges that the US will maintain nuclear forces that are, quote, responsive to the threats that we face, even while declaring that those nuclear threats are in fact growing, which begs the question of whether in this worsening environment, we actually need to do something perhaps even more. But even expressly, the NPR disavows the idea of the United States leading towards disarmament. It now says that major changes in the role of nuclear weapons in our strategies for the PRC and Russia will require verifiable reductions or constraints on their nuclear forces. So in other words, if there's a chance of resuming that long looked for path towards disarmament, the burden now lies upon China and Russia to turn things around by stopping their escalatory provocations. Now that's very commonsensical to me, but it is an extraordinarily striking change from what we were hearing from some of the same people who are now in office just a few years ago. So the US is not trying to lead anymore, and impliedly, since the threats are growing and the NPR pledges us to have a nuclear force that is responsive to those growing threats, Impliedly, it may be necessary to think about how to turn that disarmament clock to some degree back. I think that is also an extraordinary thing for this particular administration to say. It's not wrong, but it's quite an extraordinary thing. As I said before, I mean, these are not all precisely new ideas, but I think their importance lies in the fact that these key realizations about the strategic environment have now been both validated by the political right and the political left in this country. And it is very clear beyond question that we really do have a structurally new conceptual situation on our hands, something of a conceptual earthquake, if you will. So the Biden NPR signals, to summarize, these four foundations are no longer in fact operative. The strategic threat and whatever deterrence and stability dynamics are operative no longer exist on a merely dyadic basis, but are now part of at least a trilateral dynamic. Think of it as a three-body problem. The US faces not just two strategic adversaries, moreover, but a situation in which one of them has a combination of economic weight, technological sophistication, and conventional military power and global reach that the Soviets never had, even at their most threatening. Third point, proliferation is no longer the biggest nuclear threat for us in terms of our overall national interest, because we now face our gravest challenges from massive nuclear armed strategic competitors. And finally, thanks to the provocative and destabilizing actions and policies of those challengers, we can pretty much forget about forward progress on nuclear disarmament for the foreseeable future. That's a lot of change for which the nuclear policy community, especially the diplomatic community, our allies and partners around the world and the broader diplomatic world, is really not yet prepared. And it begs the question, of course, the problem being clear, what is it that we can and should do? Which is challenging because we face some qualitatively different things than we had faced before. The answer is not super obvious, precisely what we should do, to say the least. To my eye, the fundamental challenge here is actually conceptual, because we have never faced a two-peer strategic nuclear problem before. Frankly, nobody has. And it's not even clear what a stable equilibrium even is or even could be in this kind of three-body problem environment. Now, on the positive side, this might be a chance for us to think creatively about our nuclear posture. I think it's certainly true that if you were designing a nuclear posture from scratch, without all the path dependencies of what we clearly do have, if you're doing that from scratch, you probably wouldn't have exactly what we have now, even for today's threats. You wouldn't just have a miniaturized version of a legacy architecture that was built around concepts that at the very least date from 40 or more years ago. So perhaps in this very new threat environment, the challenges that we face here will give us a chance to think a little bit more creatively and more outside the box about what sorts of things we actually do need in order to deter both Russia and China, and to have at least some basic degree of preparation for whatever warfighting needs there might be in the event, God forbid, that deterrence fails. But we really haven't thought this all through yet. And the three-body problem is not well treated either in the theoretical literature or in the practical literature. So that's going to be a, without which nothing else kind of challenge, because at the moment, we don't know what optimum even looks like in that kind of a context, much less, we don't even know what would it be like even to satisfy us, as they say. So that's a challenge. And of course, in responding to these challenges, we also have the classic problems of resources and capacity and politics, frankly. One answer to this challenge might, in theory, be to keep trying to cover down on adversary targets in Russia and China in the same way that, simultaneously, in the same way that we do against just Russia. We've been doing that for a long time. But having to maintain an arsenal that is significantly larger than theirs is, challenging, to say the least. Partly for resourcing reasons. We've struggled, in fact, merely to maintain our consensus upon the existing legacy modernization. So doing more would be hard, to say the least. It's a challenge from the perspective of the productive capacity of our nuclear infrastructure. And it's challenging politically. Administrations of both political flavors have failed for a long time, or did fail for a long time, to properly support our nuclear infrastructure. More is being done in the last few years, and that is thankful, but we have a long way to go and a lot of lost ground to make up for. We have only barely maintained a consensus upon the expensive business of modernizing our legacy systems. And the Biden NPR shows to some degree that even under these conditions of threat, it has been not entirely possible to resist the temptation to engage in a little bit of anti-nuclear performative virtue signaling. by canceling a couple of weapon systems that, frankly, for which each of which provides a type of capability that for which there is not yet any kind of replacement on the horizon. That's not a great signal to my eye to send right now. But we clearly would face some significant headwinds in trying to actually massively increase our arsenal and build new systems. That doesn't mean that that's the wrong answer, but it means that we need to think these things through and do the hard work of building support and ensuring resources and human capital and political top cover for whatever it is that we think we need to do in response to the three-body problem. And we have not yet, of course, done that. Now, if it turns out that we do need a numerical increase, as John indicated, I think a short-term answer, really the only short-term answer, has to do with uploading, and he outlined some of that. Under New Start counting rules, we can already do that to a degree, but we could do it more after 2026 if we are willing to let limits go away. But we shouldn't forget, and here's a word of caution, that the Russians too cannot upload. We're not the only people who know how to do this. We're not the only people who operate under New Start counting rules right now. They have quite a few systems with hooks on them, if you will, that could be uploaded. And I suspect their productive capacity in their infrastructure is rather larger than ours. That is a note of caution to be aware of. We also shouldn't forget that China seems to be in the process of building a very significant upload hedge for itself. There are over 300 missiles, of course, missile silos being built in its western deserts, as we know now officially from the 2022 China Military Power Report. And according to that report, they might be intended to be filled with Dongfeng 41 missiles. Now that's a very large missile. It is said in that report that they are likely, the DF-41s are likely to be fielded with only 3 warheads each, but their capacity in terms of carrying power is rather greater than that. So one might imagine that if indeed the Dongfeng 41s get stuck into all those silos, China would have itself a very considerable upload capability itself. So everyone can play this game, and we need to think through very hard what we think the right answers are here. I don't think I know what they all are. In the short term, we really don't have any option other than uploading if we think that numbers are the answer. But we haven't even gotten to the point of thinking through enough whether in fact it's the case that numbers are the answer. So these are really challenging questions, and I think our immediate challenge is to get our head straight. So to conclude, I would say there are 3 short-term things to do while we try to get that head straight going. We should, and I agree with John on this, we should suspend the Biden administration's unilateral cancellation of the submarine launched cruise missile. And I would add also the B-83. That is a type of capability against hard and deeply buried targets for which there is not a clear replacement or a one-to-one replacement. And unless and until we have a concept for what's going to replace things that it can bring to the table, we probably want to keep that sucker around for a bit, although I'm not terribly fond of having anybody fly over a heavily defended target these days to drop a bomb on it. So that's not an unfair point, that there are limits on its capabilities. But until we have something in some concept for what its replacement should be, I would add that to the please don't cancel this yet list. Second, we should begin technical and programmatic preparations for an upload option. I'm not saying we should execute that option yet. We shouldn't, not unless and until we think we actually do need significantly greater numbers. Do we need to pull the trigger on that? But there are things one needs to do to be ready for that. And I think there would be a lot to be said for doing some of that prep work so that at least we retain the viable option of a crash upload project if indeed the threat set continues to be on the trajectory that it's on right now. And finally, we should rush resources as we are trying to do now, but we should double down on this and make sure that it gets the attention it needs. Resources and human capital and political support to our nuclear weapons infrastructure, because that is the, without which nothing else can happen, element of all nuclear deterrence. The strength, the capacity, the resilience, the responsiveness of our productive infrastructure it underlines our ability to deter long-term arms racing, which is precisely the problem we face right now. And it's absolutely essential, of course, if we were to decide in light of this new three-body problem challenge that we need anything in terms of weapons that is different than what we currently have. We are struggling to maintain current production levels for devices that actually are simply to replace our existing legacy attrition over time and to maintain stockpile stewardship and so forth. If we are serious about a responsive infrastructure, we will need to do more than simply talk about it nicely in 2 successive NPRs. I think the Trump administration and what I've heard from the Biden administration so far are quite sound on that. But as we all know, these are generational challenges, and we have to make sure that the support for that continues robustly. And those are simply treading water answers. The real challenge is for us to think through what on earth it is that we actually need in terms of deterrence and crisis stability. strategic stability more broadly in this new two strategic peer context. I don't think we're there yet. So we need to get that figured out as fast as we can, approach these conceptual challenges, and in the short term, make sure that we are taking steps that don't make meeting those answers, providing those answers, even harder. So long list of grimness, I'm afraid, Peter, but there we are.
Thank you, Ambassador Ford. I appreciate it. Before I turn over to David to ask a question, my colleague Michael Gordon from the Wall Street Journal told me that he wanted to ask a question to Chris. What should we do with respect to the JCPOA? What are our options?
To be perfectly honest, I'm not sure we have a lot of options. From what it appears that we are hearing and seeing from the Iranians now, even with an administration that has been something on the edge of desperate to reconstitute the JCPOA, the Iranians don't seem particularly interested. And that's true, notwithstanding the degree to which, at least in my view, and in some other people's views at least, the JCPOA is not at all disadvantageous to Iran, especially now. And what we see, even while they are in theory still trying to reconstitute the deal, time is passing, and indeed the deal itself had inbuilt some provisions under which many of its restrictions, ultimately all the significant ones, would sunset. And reconstituting a deal only in order to have in short order those very same restrictions upon Iran sunset of their own devices, in return for which Iran would have acquired a great deal of sanctions relief and so forth. I don't know that's a particularly viable option, and the Iranians don't even seem interested in that. So I don't know what the options are, frankly. I don't believe it's the case that we have a sort of stronger deal option versus JCPOA option. I think we may have a no deal option and really nothing else. And I fear that we are increasingly getting to the point where the object of our policy will be something sort of akin to keeping Iran in as small and painful a box as possible, restraining its capabilities, making it more and more difficult for it to continue to build its program forward, and making it very clear that if they cross certain red lines, such as actually trying to go from a virtual program to an actual weapons program, that very bad things will happen to them. But I'm not sure we have an agreement option at this point. There's not much sign of it. And that's more frustrating to those, I suspect, in the Biden administration than it was to those of us who pulled out of the JCPOA. But whatever one's perspective on the JCPOA, one fears that its time has passed.
Michael Gordon, would you have a follow-up? Need to unmute yourself. There you go.
I just did. I guess, thank you, Chris. I guess my only follow-up would be, just if you could just, if you were in your former position now, and let's say there was a Republican administration, you were confronted with this no JCPOA scenario, what specific steps would you take? You said you don't see restoring the agreement as a good option at this point. So, what would you do exactly?
Well, I mean, one of the problems right now is that for so long as we U.S. leaders feel that at least in theory there's the sort of the baton of a JCPOA just out of grasp, then our Iran policy will revolve essentially exclusively around trying to close the last 6 inches. There's a real risk of that. If we were to wake up tomorrow morning and admit that, even if we think that's a bad thing, if you think it's a good thing that the JCPOA is no longer an available option, then that's fine, I suppose. But even if you think it's a great deal and you wish we had it still, if you were to wake up in the morning and decide that it's no longer available, that opens up a very different range of things. And we would be able to have an Iran policy that was in fact openly devoted to providing a long-term constraint upon its regional ambitions, its access to technology, its access to financial resources and economic benefits from engagement with the outside world. You could engage in a sort of a containment and constraint approach. You're already seeing the administration being pretty, certainly better than the Obama administration was when it comes to voicing abhorrence to in the face of the crackdown on internal dissent that the Iranians are doing. You could imagine a policy that perhaps didn't have, I couldn't imagine the Biden administration being quite, having quite the sort of tone and focus that the Trump administration did on Iran, but I could see them coming to a much more hard-nosed, pain and contain kind of strategy than they have hitherto been willing to do. And that may be the only really viable option that we have left at this point.
One last thing, do you feel like the maximum pressure campaign under your previous administration failed? Because it didn't lead to any restraint on the part of the Iranians, quite the contrary.
Well, it led to a good deal of constraint upon Iran's capacity to spend resources on bad things. That's not a trivial thing. I mean, I think you need to look in terms of opportunity costs. The world didn't face a choice between an Iran that was going to indefinitely remain, remain within sort of at one point there was a sort of a 12-month breakout understanding of the JCPOA. The idea, an available option for Iran remaining constantly, forever, indefinitely at that level was never available. The deal itself was going to permit Iran to do exactly what it's doing right now. It would do it a little bit later down the line, to be sure, but it was going to absolutely permit those things. And what the deal did is it essentially valorized and gave permission for doing those things. And we face now the same problem that the JCPOA would have confronted us with our permission several years down the line, even had the deal remained in force. So we were gonna have to struggle with this, need to find a better long-term answer to the Iranian nuclear problem one way or the other, sooner or later. You can complain that it's sooner versus later, but it's not a different problem. So to pretend that there is anything different now, except that Iran has been weakened by intervening years of pressure campaign that would not have occurred under the JCPOA. We are facing the same strategic problem with Iran with a weaker, more penalized and cabined Iran than would otherwise have been the case. So I would suggest, in terms of opportunity costs, the maximum pressure campaign has put the Biden administration in a better place than would otherwise have been in order to constrain the ongoing challenges presented by Iran's nuclear program, as well as its other regional mischief.
Thank you. David, do you have a question, or we can go to the chat room here?
Yeah, I appreciate it, Peter. And before I ask my question, let me just encourage folks around the table, let Peter know if you have a question, and folks on Zoom, just put your question in the chat along with your name and organization. I wanted to ask, and it's not by accident that this morning I chose to put the B-2 behind me. It was reported over the last 24 hours that the Air Force has grounded its entire B-2 Spirit fleet and will inspect each bomber after one of the aircraft caught fire during an emergency landing earlier this month. And so for both our speakers, and John, especially for you, you named some of the new systems coming online, the new delivery platforms that are coming online to replace some of the older systems like the B-2, but that's going to take some time. And so I guess I would ask, what's the state of our nuclear deterrence? We have to bring a major system offline, at least temporarily. Can you talk about our system at large, and what is the state of our deterrence, I guess is what I'm asking.
David, let me respond by noting that, first of all, taking an element of the force, an incident or technological problem that takes out an element of our force, is what the hedge was designed to deal with. And here's what I would say. I'd say, first of all, we are losing a capability to penetrate to targets with an air-delivered system by having the B-2 out of the force for a while, however long it is, whether it's a day or a week or a month. What we might want to do under those circumstances is to consider the possibility of uploading additional outcomes on B-52s to, in part, replace some of that capability. And that would at least provide some of the numbers that are holding targets at risk that we would lose from the loss of the B-2 system for a period of time. So I think you have to think about this as a hedge problem. Something went wrong technologically in our force, and we're going to upload warheads on additional systems to make up for it.
I would add to that only just that it also illustrates the value of having a broad and diverse range of systems, and the triad itself, ultimately, in some sense, in that it's always been sort of understood that there is resilience, deterrent resilience, in having more than one type of system, multiple types of systems, so that in this kind of context, we can actually have a discussion about B-52s when the B-2s are down for a bit, because there are B-52s. We can have a discussion were there to be a problem with submarines. We can have a discussion. It wasn't just sort of abject nuclear vulnerability because we still had two other legs of the triad, for example. So having that sort of, a shot spread, a diversified portfolio, if you will, of strategic assets is something we shouldn't forget to do in the years ahead.
Thank you, Chris. We have a question from Richard Whites, who says, do we need an additional nuclear force capacity to deal with the growing North Korean threat? John, I'm going to send it over to you first.
I'll answer that very briefly. I don't think we need additional capacity to deal with the North Korean nuclear threat. I mean, I will say this a little bit simplistically. I don't believe we need nuclear weapons to deal with the North Korea threat. We can deal with it conventionally. The interesting thing about the Biden NPR is it is the first time I have seen stated in a public unclassified document our commitment that if North Korea uses a nuclear weapon, it will mean the end of the regime. So we're saying that the end of the regime will occur if any use of nuke is used. If a nuke is used, it would, for me, depend upon how it was used, when it was used, and the specific scenarios for its use before I would recommend a U.S. nuclear response. And indeed, we can deal with most of the problem of North Korea, including the elimination of the regime, totally conventionally, in my view.
Thank you, John.
I think that makes perfect sense to me. I mean, to deter, you threaten what the adversary prizes. The North Koreans have given us all kinds of signals over the years. They really don't care about much of anything except survival of the regime. And now it is expressly U.S. policy that, hey, by the way, the only thing you do care about is going to be clearly put into jeopardy if you do this particular thing. That's exactly the right signal to send.
We have a question from Chris Barrow from Coastal Carolina University. Chris, you could read it because it's addressed to you. It's, I like your phrase, theology of disarmament. How seriously should we take the TPNW and ICANW at this point?
Well, I mean, I'm not a good person to ask because I've made very clear how seriously I think we should have been taking them all along, and nothing in the recent development of the threat makes that any less true. It probably makes it even more true. It's both the case that the argument for the TPNW is weaker than it has ever been, and that's saying something in my book. But it's also the case that the asymmetry between the two sides of these discussions is actually even more clear now than before. One of the many problems, and leaving aside the issue of the legal redundancy of the TPNW in the sense that it adds absolutely nothing to the Article 2 NPT obligations of its signatories. So in a sense, it's completely useless on its own terms in terms of getting rid of nuclear weapons or adding any obligations to non-weapons possessors. Leaving that aside, leaving aside competition with the NPT and the ways in which it could undermine the safeguards agreement by reifying a sort of pre-1997 safeguard standard that we've all known for years is inadequate, even to the much less demanding job of doing regular safeguards. There is a further problem with the TPNW in the sense that the very concept of civil society activism to drive towards disarmament has a necessarily asymmetric impact upon the nuclear possessors, because, well, the degree to which civil society protest is going to change anyone's mind in the Kremlin or in Zhongnanhai in Beijing or in Pyongyang or even Tehran for that point about nuclear weapons possession and make accession to the TPNW in any way likely in any of those states. That's just sort of laughable, and it's always been sort of a silly idea. The asymmetric impact of TPNW as a project was always going to be on the democracies that are seeking to use nuclear deterrence to defend themselves against the autocracies armed with terribly dangerous weapons. That was always the case, and it's even worse now. Clearly, at this point, the TPNW has pivoted to focusing upon trying to peel off U.S. extended deterrent allies. So essentially it has declared itself unofficially to be the enemy of NATO and of our East Asian alliance relationships at a time in which Chinese and Russian threats are more dramatic than ever before. So I think there is nothing really good to be said about this. I take at face value the good intentions. I'm not questioning the good intentions of the activists behind DPNW, but I do think, especially now, it's time to turn the dial down a bit. And, maybe someday we'll get to the point where there could be an intelligent discussion to be had. This is not that time. And if anything, its impact is likely to be terribly problematic for deterrence and strategic stability, and frankly, for the avoidance of nuclear war. There's more messages to Putin that his nuclear weapons are going to give him asymmetric advantage to engage in conventional aggression in Europe is going to be deeply counterproductive, even from the TPNW's own perspective. So my hope is that they will take note of these security challenges, and I suspect that folks in Europe are going to be ever less receptive to that message as time goes forward.
I'm going to take Pat Rhodes' question. I'm going to change it a little bit, and that is, a number of people have thought that disarmament, let alone arms control, is approaching a cul-de-sac or a dead end. But where do you think the State Department is and the arms control community in terms of where they're going to go, even in that environment where it seems difficult to, where do we even go beyond a New START? Thing is, New START does expire in 2026. And there are efforts to think about, what should we do next? What are your thoughts on where the State Department may be trying to move?
Well, I would be the last person to speak for them. And I would never expect them to give up hope in that teleology. And I'm not arguing that one should give up hope. I'm just saying that hope means rather a different thing now, clearly in light of events than it might have seemed that hope meant in, say, 94 or 96 or something. Whatever the long-term answer is, clearly there isn't going to be anything happening in the disarmament arena for some considerable period of time, thanks, unfortunately, to the provocative policies and actions and postures and nuclear buildups of Russia and especially China. That doesn't mean that arms control is out of the question. There are some very interesting challenges ahead of us. We may well need some kind of arms control approach, even if that just means things like exploring transparency and confidence building measures and ways to explore what is now referred to as risk reduction in that context. There may be lots of things we can do potentially by agreement that could be useful. I think the era of sweeping reduction agreements is, if you hold your breath for that, you're going to need medical care pretty quickly. So,
Well, with that, I wanted to turn it over to John Harvey for any last comments, and then to my friend David Charrington, if he has anything that he'd like to speak finally, because we're hit the noon movement. So, John, over to you, sir. And again, thank you for your remarks as always. I always go to John Harvey for a calming, middle of the road assessment of where we are, so we can all go enjoy life and not be too worried.
Bipartisanship is my mantra. I'm going to ask a quick question of Chris. Chris, on the two nuclear peer problem, the issue of China ramping up to our levels roughly, that presents a deterrence challenge about whether we need additional forces or not. And that's a risk we have to deal with in managing this threat. But how much credibility should we give to another risk which is much more challenging, which is the possibility of a Russia-China condominium, as well as a China buildup, that is having to deter both Russia and China simultaneously? How would you rate that risk?
I mean, the instinct is say very high, but honestly, it's even hard to have that conversation. In part because we have spent so little time really thinking about it in the fullness of this context so far. It's Bismarck, I guess, in the 19th century, once referred to the nightmare of combinations. There was some kind of a phrase like that, where worried in 19th century alliance politics, what happens if you have sort of a two-front problem? If you're sort of Prussia in 1865 or something like that, right? We do have a challenge in thinking through whether and to what degree and what it would mean. There's a sort of analogous two-front potential problem with Russia and China. Now, my guess is that, I'm not sure if I'd bet the farm on this, and if I wouldn't bet the farm, then that has itself some potential implications for our policy and doctrine. But my instinct is that they are unlikely to team up in a really hard warfighting kind of sense. my guess is the game theoretical dynamics between the two of them would be like, if there's going to be a nuclear war, they would be happy to encourage the other to have it with us. So that in effect, they can sort of, they'd be the free rider on our, mutually assured destruction with the other one. So I'm not sure that, I don't know how this would actually play out in practice, but the key point though is that we really haven't had the chance to think this through much. And our strategic policy community hasn't been devoted to trying to figure these things out, particularly so far. And it's really important that we do. I mean, deterrence isn't ultimately about number to number or system to system. It may be, there may be a million different ways that deter or that don't deter. We shouldn't assume that we have to mirror anything. Deterrence is a game that is played in the wetware of the other guy, right? I'm trying to influence your decision making, and whether and to what degree any given force posture does that is a question that's going to depend upon what your wetware, what is your wetware on this, and it's a game played in somebody else's head. So we should be thinking ever more, and I think there's some very encouraging stuff in these new Biden administration national security documents about tailored deterrence. Expressly, I think it shows up 5 or 6 times as a phrase throughout the Biden, this oeuvre. And that's important. And we need to be explicitly in the business of thinking about what it is that deters the particular adversaries that we face. Keith Payne will love this phrasing, right? He's been saying this for a long, long time. But until we have thought through what deters, it's hard to know what we should have. And so we should be being more explicit about this. And of course, you only get one force posture and one declaratory policy. You can't have a different force posture. If you're facing 2 adversaries simultaneously, you can't have 2 different force postures at the same time. So we have to figure out what deters Russia and what deters China and what we think will in both cases, and then find a force posture that adequately performs against both of those threat sets. We need to find that, that this is there's not going to be a Nash equilibrium where we're going to be all super stable here. This is going to be a dynamic challenge of watching where their heads are and making sure that we do the best job possible of providing at least an adequate answer to what it is that is likely to deter them. Without giving up also on maintaining enough reserves that if deterrence were to fail, we are not unable to at least hold our own and whatever may happen at that point. So this is incredibly challenging, and we haven't thought through all these pieces yet, and it's bloody well time we start.
Yeah, John, let me just answer. Steve Blank and I have written a number of articles on the question of Russian and Chinese military cooperation. And what I've always thought is neither country would want the other one to, quote unquote, accidentally get them into a nuclear war. But they may say to each other, we're going to go do this. You go keep America busy somewhere else, like in the Korean Peninsula. Okay, where they may not be directly involved, but have one of their agents do it. So just with that, David, over to you for the final word.
I really appreciate it. Let me just say to David Crandall, we didn't get to your question on achieving ignition at the National Ignition Facility. We're planning to host an upcoming discussion on that. So please bring your question back there and make that part of the conversation. Thank you very much to our speakers today. Really a very interesting discussion. As usually when I leave these things, I leave with feeling a little bit better about things and a little bit concerned. And I try to resolve that. I'll be doing that over the next many hours. But thanks very much for bringing so much good information. Along with on behalf of the team at MITRE Deterrence Center and the team at Hudson, wishing everyone a very happy holidays and happy New Year. Look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks, everybody.
Yes, and thank John and thank Ambassador Ford. You did a great job. We appreciate it very much. Everybody, I reiterate, have a great holiday. Be safe, be well, and support America. Take care.
Thanks very much.
Great. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah.